It's very, very interesting. On the one hand, we have what most people who are not scientists believe, and they believe in a version of dualism. So we have a body and we have a soul. This is Plato, this is Descartes, right? On the other hand, we scientists believe in a version of materialism. Now, I have a picture there of the Terminator, not because I think that we are like the Terminator, right? We're not programmed to kill Sarah Connor. But what's interesting about the Terminator, I'm sure you've all seen the movie, is that we have a creature that can think, that can talk, that can make decisions, that even seems to be conscious, thanks to the creator of the Terminator. You can see there's something it is like to be a Terminator. You can see the world out there, it's all red, there are parameters floating in front of your eyes. But we know that the Terminator is a machine. It's physical through and through. There's no soul, no vapor, nothing. It's a machine, and yet it can think and do all these things. So by analogy, the way scientists think of us human beings is that we are biological versions of the Terminator. Right? We're biological machines of sorts, beautiful machines, thinking, feeling machines, but machines nonetheless. And that we're physical through and through. These are radically different worldviews, and they have radical implications for a lot of issues that are very important. So, who cares, you might ask? Is this just an academic exercise? Do we like to just think about this in our offices at universities? Say, well, is it materialism or dualism? Well, it turns out it really matters. And you heard some of the arguments mentioned last night in Richard Dawkins' talk, for example. So it matters a lot for an issue that is rehashed every election cycle in the United States, the question of whether abortion should be illegal or illegal. It also matters whether you are a materialist or a dualist for questions that have to do with, say, stem cell research. These are not stem cells, by the way, so don't let the biologists get upset with me. That's the best I could find on the internet. It also matters for questions about the end of life and whether we should have the right to die with dignity. And finally, it matters for our entire criminal justice system and how we view moral responsibility and human agency, and therefore how we should punish or to what extent we should punish people. So it really matters for a lot of important questions. So let's talk now about science and the soul. A question that I asked the students in my surveys was the following. Do you believe that the question of whether human beings have a soul is a question that can be answered objectively, at least in principle, and therefore do you believe that it's a question that can be answered using scientific means? The overwhelming response was no. Okay? What's even more interesting is that the believers in the soul, 90% of them said, no, it's not a scientific question, it's a religious question, it's a metaphysical question. People who did not believe in the soul were much more open, said, yeah, it's okay, it's a scientific question. This is well known in psychology. There's an effect that's called the scientific impotence excuse. You don't like evidence that is going to contradict your worldview? Well, what you say is, look, it's not a scientific question, so you can bring all the evidence you want. It's not going to have any bearing on what I believe, because what I believe is not a scientific proposition or a scientific question. But of course, the soul that we defined a few moments ago is a scientific question. And it's not hard to see. And it comes from two main reasons. The first one is what I call detachability and autonomy of function. Remember, the claim is that your soul can detach somehow from your physical body and continue to function when you're dead. Well, this makes clear predictions that could be tested empirically. Suppose, for example, that we could talk to the dead. Not saying we can. Of course we can't. There's no evidence that we can. But if we could, if you have Uncle Bob's ashes in an urn, you're pretty confident that the body has ceased to function. But what if you could actually communicate meaningfully with Uncle Bob? That would be very good evidence that something continues to exist after death. And doing an experiment that is controlled to show this is not hard to do at all. I could have a couple undergrads in my lab design the protocol. So in principle, we could have evidence that we have something like the soul. Likewise, when people have near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences and they claim that their soul is floating about the room and can see and hear everything, and then it re-enters their body. People have done experiments where they've placed laptop computers on top of closets, displaying certain numbers or images. Now, what if someone who was lying in a bed and could not possibly see from their physical body's restricted vantage point what was on the laptop? What if upon regaining consciousness, they could recite faithfully, dare I say, the numbers or the sequences on the laptop under controlled conditions? What if this were replicable? Then we'd have really good evidence, scientific evidence, that something can happen, that cognition can happen outside the confines of the physical body. That would be evidence for something like the soul. So there could be evidence for the soul. That's the first reason. The second reason has to do with what I call causal interaction with ordinary matter. If the soul is going to do something for you, as people believe, if it's going to give you a moral compass, if it's going to give you consciousness, if it's going to give you your ability to make decisions, it has to be able to causally interact with ordinary matter, right? That immaterial stuff is going to have to affect the behavior of the elementary particles in your brain for something to happen. Now, anytime you postulate something that can causally interact with ordinary matter, you're making a claim about physics. Physicists are in the business. I don't know if Lawrence Krauss is here today. Is he? No, he's sleeping still. Okay, that's fine. He had a hard night, I'm sure, last night. But you're making a claim about physics. So, yes, the soul is a scientific claim, absolutely. And I'm not the first one to say this. If you read Bertrand Russell's classic essays on science and religion back in 1935, he has a little section on the soul in which he says, I'm quoting now almost verbatim, that there could be evidence that would convince reasonable men. And he had the kind of evidence that I have in mind. Now, if you take, it sort of embarrasses me to put Bertrand Russell and Dinesh D'Souza on the same slide for reasons that you should be familiar with. But Dinesh D'Souza, who knows nothing about science, is not a scientist, yet talks about quantum physics and cosmology and everything. There's one thing he says in his book, the only thing that I agree with, which is, yes, the soul is a scientific claim. Okay? So it is a scientific claim. So now we can be a bit more precise and we can define our hypotheses. We have a dualistic hypothesis on the one hand that says that human beings are composed of a physical body and an immaterial, psychologically potent and immortal soul, the soul that we defined a few moments ago. Body and soul are distinct entities, and the soul can continue to exist and function independently from the body after we die. That's the dualistic hypothesis. By contrast, we can have a materialistic hypothesis that says that the mind, the domain of the soul, at least the modern soul, the history of soul beliefs is very interesting, cannot function separately from the body for the simple reason that our mental experiences are caused by physical activity in the brain. What we cognitive scientists call mind is nothing but a description of the functioning of the brain at some level of abstraction. If this is not quite clear, I can show you an analogy later to show you what that really means. So what that means is that body and soul are two sides of the same coin. Now, notice that these two hypotheses are mutually incompatible. They can't both be true. Either we have a soul or we don't have a soul. We don't have half a soul. So here's a case of a clear dichotomy. You either have a soul or you don't have a soul. There's no in between, right? So how can we decide? How can we decide what's more likely to be true? How do we decide whether we're more likely to be creatures that are part beast, part angel, or that are fully materialistic? Well, it's not hard in principle. We've known how to evaluate scientific hypotheses since the late 16th century. We decide the same way we decide whether the Earth is more likely to be flat or round. We look at the world, we look at the evidence, we look at what we know about science, and we decide based on that. And when we do that, what we find is that all the evidence, all the scientifically meaningful evidence converges, tells us that materialism is much more likely to be true. Philosophers of science call this consilience of evidence. This is how we know, for example, that evolution is true. There's a number of lines of evidence that all converge. Right? There's evidence from the fossil record, there's evidence from molecular biology, there's evidence from comparative anatomy. They all point in the same direction. So that's how strong scientific theories are built. Now, I wish I had more time to spend on this slide because it's absolutely fascinating, but I just want to give you the gist of I want to tell you what those lines are, and then we can talk about them later if you'd like. I wish I had another hour or two to talk to you about this. It's absolutely fascinating. But it turns out that the soul has shrunk as scientific understanding has progressed. There used to be many souls a few thousand years ago. And as we've understood science better, the soul has shrunk to basically one soul, the soul that we talk about today. There's no formalism that describes the activity of the soul. That's very important. I could tell you more about, I'll just tell you just a bit of scientific trivia, but when Isaac Newton published his famous Principia in 1687, he was really baffled by his own discoveries. There are quotes from him saying it's absurd, that matter should have the property of gravity, of attracting other matter instantaneously at a distance. That's just so counterintuitive, it can't be right. And he even, if you read the footnotes of the Principia, he even said, whether it's a material or immaterial force, I let my readers decide. Okay? So one might say, hey, if Newton proposed something that could have been immaterial, why not a soul? But Newton had equations. Okay? Newton, for example, for the law of gravity, had the famous inverse square law that allowed scientists to make accurate predictions about the behavior of objects. There is no such thing for the soul. There are no soul equations that can tell you whether people are going to behave morally or not, or whether they're conscious or not. That's a huge problem. There's no objective empirical evidence that we have souls, but there could be. There could be. I told you a few moments ago. Souls fly in the face of everything we know about modern science. That includes physics. That includes biology. That includes cognitive science, neuroscience, and psychology. There's no explanatory gain that comes from postulating the existence of the soul. Let me try this with you real quick. So one thing that we currently do not really understand is consciousness. You may have heard philosophers talk about qualia. Ooh, qualia, it's mysterious. We don't know how it works. Let's try this now. I tell you now, the soul does it. Now ask yourself this question. Do you understand consciousness any better? No. Right? The soul does it means I don't have a clue how it works, so I'll just use that word. It's a placeholder for our ignorance. Or God does it, same thing. And finally, there's overwhelming evidence for the materialistic hypothesis. They can't both be true, right? Remember. So when you think about it all together, it looks like the soul has exactly the set of properties that it should have if it didn't exist. And that's why modern scientists have abandoned the notion of the soul. So you might say, now, what about all the evidence that these guys talk about? Well, they're very clever in a way. So you can think of evidence as one big set of things, right? And it's true that, so if I ask you, is there evidence that the Earth is stationary? There's plenty of evidence. Do you feel like we're moving around the sun at 67,000 miles per hour now? No, of course not. So you can say, look, here's evidence that the Earth is stationary. The Greeks proposed that the Earth is in motion, but you know why they rejected the idea? Because it flew in the face of common sense. So these people say, well, there's evidence for the soul. Here, look, near-death experiences, this and that. But what they invariably do not tell their readers, on purpose or not, is that there's a distinction between evidence, broadly speaking, and scientifically acceptable evidence. What counts as scientific evidence? And they blur the line. And it's hard if you're not a trained scientist to sometimes make the difference. So that's how they fool people into thinking that there is scientific evidence. If there was scientific evidence for the soul, then scientists would say, oh yeah, there is. They don't. You've seen the data. They don't think that. So let's talk about the implications now. So when I give this presentation to students, for example, or people at a church, a very common reaction when you tell them, look, this is very, very unlikely, okay? We probably don't have souls. Common reaction is people kind of freak out. Oh, wow, it's just can't take this, like this is bad. But it's not, okay? And I want to show you this. So there's a sense in which nothing changes. So here's an analogy. So take the behavior of mundane physical objects. If I were to release the clicker from my hand, what would happen? It would fall to the ground. I could have any one of you do it. We can replicate this. If the word fact means anything in English, it's a fact that released objects fall to the ground unless they're attached by a wire or what have you. Okay? Now, how can we explain this fact? Well, it depends. If you go back in time, for example, Aristotle had an explanation. It was called a teleological explanation. So objects fall to the center of the earth, to the ground, because that's where they want to be. right? It was goal-driven. Well, don't laugh. I mean, he was a really, really smart guy. We didn't have science back then, right? All we had was our intuitions. And in fact, our intuitions, it turns out, are Aristotelian when it comes to physics. I'm sure much to the dismay of modern physicists. Fast forward the tape to the 17th century, Isaac Newton now dispensed with this explanation, came up with a new explanation. Now there's a goalless force of gravity that he quantified mathematically that accounts for the behavior of apples, well, supposedly, clickers that didn't exist back then, planetary motion, the tides. Go back, now fast forward to the beginning of the 20th century, and the explanation changes again. 1905, 1915, Albert Einstein develops his theory of relativity, and now physicists tell us that what causes gravity is the curvature of space-time. So notice that what changes is the explanation. The facts don't change. Apples fell to the ground when released at the time of Aristotle, at the time of Newton, and at the time of Einstein. And they'll continue to do so in the foreseeable future until things get too ugly in the universe. So suppose now that someone were to say, oh, I just heard that Aristotle was wrong. I'm so worried. I'm worried that all my precious material possessions are going to start flying off into the sky. You'd say this is silly. Facts don't change, only explanations change. If we transpose the analogy to human beings now, what's a comparable set of facts about people? Now I'm talking about mature adults with no pathologies, okay? Well, as mature adults with no pathologies, we have complex mental lives, okay? We can be happy or jealous or sad or what have you, and we have flexible behavior, okay? Flexible will. Well, what accounts for these facts about human beings? The answer used to be, until about the middle of the 20th century, that we have no idea, so we'll say that the soul does it. Yeah, the soul gives you a moral compass, and the soul gives you consciousness, and the soul gives you your ability to make decisions. But the explanation has changed. We don't talk about the soul doing this anymore. Now we talk about the brain and the mind. But notice that the facts haven't changed. It's not because scientists tell you tomorrow that you fall in love because of chemicals in your brain. You still fall in love. People are still going to fall in love. People are still going to admire sunsets. The facts remain. There's nothing to worry about. Only there's a lot to worry about, because there's a sense in which everything changes once you remove the soul from the equation. In addition to the mundane properties that we talked about, the soul narrative used to give us two kinds of magical powers. One is immortality, of course, and the other one is a particular kind of free will. I'm not going to talk about immortality. I'm happy to talk to you about this later, but I want to focus on the question of free will, because it's absolutely fascinating. And now I'm going to connect this to the beginning of the presentation about the implications of the demise of the soul. I'm going to focus on the question of moral responsibility and our criminal justice system. So it's a little complicated, but I want to give you a sense of what the general argument is, the logic, the structure of the argument, and then I'm going to show you how it applies to the case of the soul. Here's the general argument. The general argument is that the wrong theories of how the world works lead to the wrong ideas, the wrong practices, and the wrong policies. So go back, you can take plenty of examples today, but if you to take a more dramatic example, if we go back in time to, say, medieval times, and think about the witch theory of causality. People really believed that there were witches, women who cavorted with demons to create all kinds of calamities. And so what they would do is they say, well, look, we have to get rid of those witches. We have to, torture them, and we have to burn them, and we have to drown them. I just thought of something about witches. So Donald Trump recently said that, he was being harassed, and it was a witch hunt. And I posted on Facebook, well, when you're actually a witch, you shouldn't be, what you expect. So this was back, right? Now, once your theory of how the world works changes, once you have science and you realize, look, we don't have bad weather because of witches, then torturing women makes no sense anymore. In fact, it's cruel. So applied to the issue at hand, it turns out that mind-body dualism is the wrong theory of human nature. And so it too can lead to the wrong ideas, the wrong practices, and the wrong policies. In particular, I'm going to show you that notions of punishment that are based on retribution in our criminal justice system hinge on that flawed notion of human nature. And this is particularly important in, at least, I don't know about Canada as much, but in the US we have the most dysfunctional criminal justice system in the first world. So USA, USA. And so that's a huge problem. So let's see now how the argument unfolds. So I have to begin by telling you about free will. It's been talked about for 2,000 years. I'll do this in 2 slides. So the best illustration I've seen of free will is a cartoon from Dilbert. Dilbert and his dog, Dogbert, who's very smart. So Dogbert says to Dilbert, "Do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do?" And Dilbert says, "Well, of course." "Well, then how can we blame people for their actions?" Smart dog, huh? Dilbert says, "Well, because people have free will to do as they choose." "Are you saying that free will is not part of the brain?" "Well, of course it is, but it's the part of the brain that's out there just being kind of free." So you're saying the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Well, obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for anything they do. "Do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby?" Shut up. That is the problem of free will, in essence. So this alludes to a notion of free will that is known in the philosophical literature as libertarian free will. Sometimes it's called contra-causal free will or agent causation. And Theopedia, straight from the office of Mike Pence, gives us a very nice definition. You guys were a little slow on this one, huh? Yeah. Okay, good. It tells us that libertarian free will means that our choices are free from the determination or constraints of human nature, and that libertarian freedom is essential for moral responsibility. For if our choice is determined or caused by anything, including our own desires, it cannot be properly called. I really apologize for this. I hope nobody's going to get a seizure. It cannot properly be called a free choice. So let me show you now how this dovetails with the notion of the soul. We are very complex creatures, and many forces and factors impinge upon us when we have to make decisions and choices. The kinds of genes we have is going to play a role. The kinds of brain chemistry, the processes happening in the brain is going to play a role. The laws of nature, the laws of physics are going to play a role. Our life history is going to play a role. The environment in which we grew up is going to play a role. The state of the universe at the time we have to make a decision is going to play a role. But notice that all these things are causal factors that you do not control. And that on the assumption that libertarian free will is real and matters, your actions cannot be caused by anything. So how do soul believers resolve that problem? Very easily. If there's a soul now, remember the soul is psychologically potent, so it has causal powers. It can cause us to do what we do. But it itself, being immaterial, non-physical, is not caused by anything. Therefore, it's the ultimate uncaused cause. Bingo, you have libertarian free will. We have an uncaused cause. If you ask someone who believes in this, what causes your actions, they will say, my will. What causes your will? Nothing. It's uncaused. It's free. Great. Well, now suppose we say, as we do, there's no soul. Now people are worried. They say, well, but if there's no soul, we're fully caused. So how can we be held morally accountable? That's terrible. And people have intuitions about this. So I'm going to test yours. Suppose we have a boulder that's been sitting there for centuries, and because of that hoax that China perpetrated called global warming, it's losing its grip on the other two rocks, and eventually it falls down, comes crashing down the hill and flattens a few houses at the bottom and kills a few dozen people. Now suppose you ask the question, could the boulder have done otherwise than it did? What's your intuition? No. The boulder is sensitive to gravity and erosion, and it can't control any of this. So it did the only thing that it could do under those very circumstances. Now suppose we have a troubled youth there on the right. Terrible genes, terrible environment. He was molested for more than 15 minutes when he was a child. It's really terrible. He needs money for drugs. So he goes to a convenience store, pulls a gun, because we have more guns than people in the US. USA. He ends up pulling the trigger because the clerk doesn't want to give the money, and he ends up pulling the trigger. Now, suppose you ask, could the young man have chosen to do otherwise? What's your intuition? Yeah, well, no. If you think about this, then, so your intuitions tell you one thing. If you reason about it, you'll get a different conclusion. Even if there was a conscious decision at some point on the part of the young man to pull the trigger, what do you think caused the conscious decision? Not the soul, it's unconscious brain activity. That's what causes conscious decisions. What influences unconscious brain activity? Well, a host of factors, the genes you have, the laws of nature and chemistry, your life environment. So you can trace a full causal chain, going all the way back to the Big Bang if you want. And those factors are not under the control of the person. We are part of the causal nexus. We're not different from boulders and galaxies and ants and black holes in that regard. But of course, there's a sense in which we're different from boulders, right? We have the power of reason. But we are fully caused. We're made of the same elementary particles than these things are made of. So now we can see what the problem is, or at least what the apparent problem is. People will tell you, look, you scientists are telling us that boulders are fully caused, and now you're telling us that people too are fully caused. They don't have a soul that is an uncaused cause. So if we don't hold boulders morally accountable, then why on earth should we hold people morally accountable? There are two answers to this. A sort of a practical answer and a more radical answer. I'll show you what the practical answer is. The more radical answer is, who says we have to keep the notion of moral responsibility? Now you might say, that's crazy. But if you think about it, it's not that crazy. All we need really is causal responsibility, and then trying to understand why the person did what they did, and how likely it is that they are to do it again, and what we should do about it. But let me give you a more practical answer. Now, there's a sense in which this is a false problem, because who says that the relevant dimension upon which we have to anchor our notion of moral responsibility is whether or not people are fully caused? There's no law of nature that says that's the relevant dimension. Could we find a dimension that differentiates boulders and people upon which we can anchor our notion of moral responsibility? Of course we can. Think about the power of reason. I mean something very mundane by that. The ability to consciously think about the consequences of our actions, to anticipate their effects, to treat other people as moral agents, etc. That's the power of reason. Do boulders have that? We don't think so. Great. Do people have that? Well, yes. Can it be diminished? Yes, if you're a child, if you're mentally ill. That's all the law needs. When you hear people in the law talk about mens rea, a guilty mind, they don't care about free will, they care about the power of reason. So that's a practical answer. So now I want to show you how this, it's just a long argument, right? How this affects the notion of moral responsibility and punishment. This is a wonderful paper, by the way, by Joshua Green and his former mentor, called For the Law, Neuroscience Changes Nothing and Everything. So in that paper, they discuss the two traditional reasons why we have punished people. One is based on retribution. It's backward looking. We look back at the moment at which the person committed the crime and we say, well, he could have done otherwise, but he chose not to do what should have been the right thing to do, and so we're going to punish him and we're going to make him suffer because he deserves to be punished and he deserves to suffer. Notice that this approach, retribution, is based on a set of libertarian intuitions. If you think that the person could have done otherwise, then yes, it makes some amount of sense to want to punish them. The other traditional approach is forward-looking. It's based on what's called consequentialism. You ask, well, ask not if the person could have done otherwise. Ask whether they're likely to strike again or not. So we punish people on this approach because we want to contain them. If we have a rapist in a small town, and they already have raped someone, we can't go back in time and undo the rape, as horrible as it is, but we can certainly prevent that person from raping again. We can contain them. That's why we punish people. but we don't have to make them suffer unnecessarily. Now, this approach is based on a much broader set of intuitions. You don't have to be a libertarian free will believer to espouse this notion. Now, notice what happens the minute you remove the soul from the equation and say, well, libertarian free will is just an illusion, then guess what this does? It sweeps the rug from under the rationale for punishing people in a retributive way and to make them suffer. That just doesn't make any sense anymore. Just like it doesn't make any sense anymore to burn or drown witches. So here's what Green and Cohen end up saying. They say, we maintain that advances in neuroscience are likely to change the way people think about human action and criminal responsibility. Free will, as we ordinarily understand it, is an illusion. Retributivist notions of criminal responsibility ultimately depend on this illusion, and if we are lucky, they will give way to consequentialist ones, thus radically transforming our approach to criminal justice. They go on to say that at this time, this was maybe a decade ago, the law deals firmly but mercifully with individuals whose behavior is obviously the product of forces that are ultimately beyond their control. Someday, the law may treat all convicted criminals this way, that is, humanely. Charles Darwin already talked about this. He saw that. De la Mettrie, one of the 18th century French materialists, at the end of L'Homme Machine, Man is a Machine, was ebullient about this, saying, look, this is great. It's a basis for progress. Of course, this matters in our country, perhaps less so in Canada, because we have a terrible system of criminal justice. Here's what a scholar in the field, here's how he summarized the whole system. He said that it's a punishment system that no one would knowingly have built from the ground up. It is often unjust, it is unduly severe, it is wasteful, and it does enormous damage to the lives of Black Americans. This is something that Barack Obama at least paid lip service to. Obama wants to end mass incarceration, can he? Well, he hasn't. And now with this guy in power, I had to, everybody else had a Trump joke, okay? I had to have one too. This cracked me up for days. But it's funny today, but it's sad in reality for what has happened. Okay, perfect. So I have 15 minutes left. I'm going to briefly summarize and show you one last short video clip. So in summary then, what I've tried to show you in the course of only an hour, but you should buy the book and read it so you'll get more, is that the soul, the traditional soul, is a scientific claim, that science tells us that science doesn't tell us there is no soul, by the way. Science tells us it's very, very, very unlikely that we have a soul. How unlikely? Let me give you an analogy because I have a bit more time. Suppose you have a friend suppose I have a friend who's a very good athlete. And I tell you, you know, this guy is really, really good. Here's my claim. He can run a marathon under 10 minutes. He's not an enhanced human being. Okay, he doesn't have rockets in his shoes. He's just a regular human being. But he's super, super fit. And he can run a marathon under 10 minutes. How plausible is this claim? Would you have to run an experiment to falsify it? Of course not. Given what we know about the world, given what we know about the length of a marathon, given what we know about human locomotion, the claim is supremely implausible. Okay? Do you think we have a soul? Well, think about the analogy. Given what we know about the world and science, it's about as plausible as the claim that a guy could run a marathon under 10 minutes. So for all practical purposes, we don't have souls. Even though as a good scientist, and Richard Dawkins did this in The God Delusion, I think if I'm not mistaken, you had a scale, right, from 1 to 7, saying, I'm not going to say 7, but 6.9, that God doesn't exist. Okay. Practically speaking, it means, not very likely. So now I want to show you one last video clip. So I usually play this in audiences who are not the choir as you are, but you'll see the point I try to make for a broader audience. So let's watch. And we can crank up the sound because it's good music.
All right, this is an oldie, but, well, it's an oldie where I come from. All right, guys, let's do some blues riff and beat. Watch me for the changes and try to keep up, okay? I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
So that's what I usually tell people in a larger, more mixed crowd. I say, you may not be ready for this, but your kids will love it. Thank you very much. Thank you.